Bloodborne is a work of Gothic fiction, and by now everyone knows how its narrative and aesthetic borrow heavily from 19th century horror literature. But in today's video, I want to dive deep into Cainhurst, analyzing how the castle and its inhabitants echo the elements found in vampire stories from Gothic literature, especially Dracula, the castle of Otranto, and Carmilla. So, let's begin a new journey through dark narratives and Gothic fiction. I was reading Dracula again, and it was impossible not to think of Bloodborne. That's when the idea came, to connect Gothic vampires from literature with Cainhurst, in another analysis comparing video games with literature. In the world of Bloodborne, Castle Cainhurst is one of the most atmospheric Gothic locations. This desert castle, frozen in time, is filled not only with Gothic literary references, but with clear ties to vampire lore, especially the archetype of aristocratic vampires, mysterious, sensual beings who live in isolated castles, like Annalise, Queen of the Vilebloods. Cainhurst Castle was once home of the Vilebloods, an aristocratic group who gained access to the Old Blood, defying the authority of the Healing Church. What no one expected was that the nobles would have a different reaction to the blood. They did not become beasts. Instead, they retained their human form and a kind of immortality. The goal of the clan was to satisfy their queen, Annalise, by collecting and consuming blood to preserve the purity of the Vileblood line. The game never uses the word vampire, but the vampiric aesthetic is unmistakable, especially in a game filled with Gothic references. In many ways, the Vilebloods are Bloodborne's answer to the vampire of Gothic fiction, decadent nobles sustained by forbidden blood. I won't dive into Cainhurst's backstory, that's been covered by many other videos. The goal here is to explore how Bloodborne connects to 19th century Gothic horror literature. The very name Vileblood suggests a tainted bloodline, a recurring theme in Gothic fiction, especially when portraying nobles or elites hiding monstrous truths, like Dracula, Dr. Jekyll, Lord Manfred, and Carmilla. Carmilla is a novella written in 1872 by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu. It tells the story of a vampiric countess with dark desires for a young noblewoman. And it's with Carmilla that I want to start this comparison, especially her connection to Queen Annalise of Cainhurst, the leader of this aristocratic group known as the Vilebloods. In my previous videos on the women of Bloodborne and their connection to Edgar Allan Poe, I talked about how Annalise was likely inspired by Lady Bathory, and how Bathory herself was the inspiration for Carmilla, or rather Countess Mircalla Karnstein. She's a seductive aristocrat, a supernatural being who survives through the centuries, collecting lovers and victims, remaining young and beautiful by consuming their blood. She was what is called a fine-looking woman for her time of life, and must have been handsome. She was tall, but not thin, and dressed in black velvet and looked rather pale, but with a proud and commanding countenance, though not agitated strangely. There was something in this lady's air and appearance so distinguished and even imposing, and in her manner so engaging, as to impress one, quite apart from the dignity of her equipage, with a conviction that she was a person of consequence. Queen Annalise of Cainhurst bears a striking resemblance to both Bathory and Carmilla. Both are aristocratic women, rumored to use blood for immortality, living secluded in haunted Gothic castles. Both are described as beautiful. In the game, we first see Annalise with a helmet that hides her seductive face, but concept arts and paintings around the castle depict her ethereal beauty. Seated on her throne, elegant and eternally beautiful, Annalise speaks with a seductive voice and mocks the player's attempts at devotion. A mere hunter showing interest in an immortal noble? Impossible. Annalise is above all, Not even her enemies, the Healing Church and the executioners, could destroy her. Much like Carmilla, who deceives hunters and victims alike for centuries, staying alive and seductive until her end, when she's finally decapitated and burned, lifting the curse from the region. A curious parallel. Annalee's sensual aesthetic, with long hair and a slow, provocative voice, also mirrors the transformation seen in Dracula's female victims. Beyond the famous vampire's brides, we have the example of Lucy, Mina's friend, who is repeatedly beaten by Dracula and eventually becomes a sensual vampire. When Lucy, I call the thing that was before us Lucy, because it bore her shape, saw us, she drew back with an angry snore, such as a cat gives us when taken unawares. Then her eyes range over us. Lucy's eyes in form and color, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hellfire, instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. As she looked, her eyes blazed with unholy light, and the face became wreathed with a voluptuous smile. She still advanced, however, and with a languorous, voluptuous grace said, "Come to me, Arthur. Leave these others and come to me." There is also a strong connection between Cainhurst's location and classic vampire lore. Like Carmilla, Annalise lives in an isolated, abandoned castle. Bloodborne is filled with Victorian architecture, but Cainhurst is clearly inspired by Eastern European buildings, especially castles from the Holy Roman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The castle entrance, for instance, strongly resembles the staircase of Palace Castle, located in Romania, close to Transylvania. And Carmilla's story also takes place in Eastern Europe, especially in the Duchy of Styria, once part of the Holy Roman Empire, north of the present-day Slovenia. Carmilla's castle, home of the Cainhurst noble family, was ruined and decaying, just like the Cainhursts themselves, cursed and dying. Not unlike Cainhurst, which still stands, but is slowly falling into ruin, along with the fading bloodline of the Vilebloods. "And this was once the palatial residence of the Cainhursts," said the old general at length, as from a great window he looked out across the village and saw the wild, undulating expanse of forest. "It was a bad family, and here its blood-stained annals were written." He continued, "It is hard that they should, after death, continue to plague the human race with their atrocious lusts." Cainhurst, much like Yharnam, is a breathtaking setting. Even though it's filled with monstrous creatures, we arrive at the castle through a coach ride, triggered by a mysterious invitation addressed to the hunter. An old blood-stained summons, inviting an honored guest to the forsaken castle Cainhurst. Rather baffling, it is addressed to you. Do not hesitate. The stagecoach leaves from Hamwick Crossing. The castle is isolated, surrounded by water, perched off the edge of a cliff. Before this moment, it could only be seen from afar, through certain vantage points in Hamwick. The arrival at Cainhurst is emblematic, and in many ways it feels like a direct homage to Dracula, the Victorian horror classic written by Bram Stoker and published in 1897. First, because both journeys happen in a carriage drawn by black horses, shrouded in mystery. And second, because both the hunter's and Jonathan's travels are supernatural. The hunter discovers, upon reaching Cainhurst, that the horses who brought him or her had long been dead. Meanwhile, Jonathan travels with ghastly passengers and strange lights, with one of them even whispering the ominous German phrase, "Den die Toten reiten schnell," for the dead travel fast. That quote seems to fit perfectly within the world of Bloodborne. Stoker uses the journey to Dracula's castle to mark Harker's entry into a supernatural realm, and something similar happens in Bloodborne. The player has already witnessed unspeakable horrors throughout Yharnam, but Cainhurst feels different. It is a place of temporal suspension, ethereal yet grotesque. filled with new monsters unlike anything seen before in the game. What strikes players the most upon entering Cainhurst is the snow, something entirely absent from the rest of Yharnam. And just like Jonathan's Harker's arrival, a mysterious cold begins to shape this landscape. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks. And the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered with a white blanket. In both journeys, the carriage drops the traveler at the gates of an ancient stone castle, looming out the fog. Harker's first glimpse of Castle Dracula is filled with a moment of dread. What was he doing there? What would await him behind those towering doors? Similar questions arise in the mind of the player upon entering Cainhurst. I must have been asleep, for certainly if I had been fully awake, I must have noticed the approach of such a remarkable place. In the gloom, the courtyard looked of considerable size, and as several dark ways led from under great roach arches, it perhaps seemed bigger than it really is. I stood in silence where I was, for I did not know what to do. Of bells or knockers there was no sign. The time I waited seemed endless, and I felt doubts and fears crowding upon me. What sort of place had I come to, and among what kind of people? What sort of green adventure was it on which I had embarked? Another similarity between both stories is the eerie realization that such a massive castle could be quietly empty. Aside from gargoyles and a few ghost ladies and servants, there are no people. There are no noble survivors of the Vilebloods dynasty, no hunters, not even disturbed townsfolk like in Yharnam. For such an imposing structure, the emptiness of Cainhurst is unsettling, bringing a chilling sense of isolation. Jonathan Harker also notes that Dracula's castle is devoid of servants. After all, a vampire has little need for them. The difference is that Cainhurst was once full of life, which we can sense from the portraits of its former resident and the beautiful dining halls. Cainhurst, like Dracula's castle, is steeped in aristocratic decay, a place once glorious, now abandoned. We don't know much about who Dracula was in Stoker's novel. Many of the myths about the Count were added later through adaptations. But we can assume he once lived as a man, a noble, still respected and feared by the local villagers. Cainhurst also held statues in Yharnam. Its members were part of a proud bloodline, now extincted, with Annalise as its last true remnant. We know that Lady Maria came from Cainhurst, but her bond to its aristocracy ended long ago. Thus, both castles can be seen as grand, beautiful palaces, now abandoned, frozen in time, slowly decaying with the memories of the past. In the summer of this year, we made a journey to Transylvania and went over the old ground which was and is to us so full of vivid and terrible memories. Every trace of all that had been was blotted out. The castle stood as before, reared high above a waste of desolation. Bloodborne is often remembered for its Lovecraftian cosmic horror, but Cainhurst Castle stands apart as a love letter to Victorian Gothic. Wandering its halls feels like walking through a black and white horror movie, or the haunted castles of Gothic novels. The developers knew exactly what they were doing. Tall spires and archways, candlelit corridors, suits of armor lining a grand staircase, and gargoyle statues that came to life as monsters. The outdoor areas are covered in snow, evoking Dracula's castle and the cold nights of Transylvania. Inside, furniture and tapestries tell the tale of a once wealthy aristocracy, now in decay. It is easy not only to think of Dracula, but also of the father of the Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, written by the Count Horace Walpole and published in 1764. Walpole's novel was a pioneer in blending realism and supernatural elements. ghosts, shadowy corridors, and secret passages inside a haunted castle. It has also introduced key archetypes of the genre: the decadent noble villain and the pure maiden, the forbidden woman that would become a trope in Gothic romance. I discussed this in my previous video on Bloodborne and Edgar Allan Poe. Cainhurst Castle itself is filled with hidden passages, opened by secret mechanisms that led to forbidden areas. The lower part of the castle was hollowed into several intricate cloisters, and it was not easy for one under so much anxiety to find the door that opened into the cavern. An awful silence reigned throughout those subterraneous regions, except now and then some blasts of wind that shook the door she had passed, and which, grating of the rusty hinges, were re-echoed through that long labyrinth of darkness. Every murmur struck her with new terror, yet more she dreaded to hear the wrathful voice of Manfred urging his domestics to pursue her. Beyond the architecture, the enemies in Cainhurst further reinforced the vampire theme. The Silver Ladies, as I mentioned earlier, are ghostly ethereal beings mourning the fall of the Vilebloods. Their appearance mirrors the pale, Gothic damsels of literature, except they are already dead. In contrast to the elegance of these ladies, we have the bloodlickers, bloated, leech-like monsters with distended tongues, lurking in Cainhurst. Their name says it all: grotesque beings who live near blood-sucked areas, gorging themselves on every drop of blood they can consume. In Dracula, when Jonathan Harker finds the Count resting in his coffin after feeding, he described him as looking bloated. And then I saw something which filled my very soul with horror. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth has been half restored. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his reflection. I shuddered as I bent over to touch him, and every sense in me revolted at the contact, but I had to research, or I was lost. Then I stopped and looked at the Count. There was a mocking smile on the bloated face which seemed to drive me mad. This isn't the only grotesque moments tied to the vampire. Earlier, Jonathan sees Dracula crawling down the walls of the castle, his first true glimpse that he is no ordinary human. At first, I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, and by thus, using every projection and inequality, move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along the wall. What manner of man is this? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear, and there is no escape for me. It wasn't the moonlight deceiving Jonathan, and just like him, the hunter cannot be deceived by what he or she sees in Cainhurst. This is a place outside of time, filled with supernatural beings, creatures unlike anything we face in Yarnan. Ultimately, the decadence of Cainhurst is not only about physical decay, but moral depravity. Their quest for pleasure and immortality led them into a world of depravity and extinction. In this sense, the game aligns with the Gothic tradition of portraying aristocrats as moral monsters, like Lord Manfred in Otranto, or Dracula, or Carmilla. The nobles of Cainhurst, in placing themselves above the laws of Yarnan, become literal monsters through indulgency. Many retain their human beauty, but mask a monstrous within, and in the end, both the beautiful and the monstrous share the same fate: death and oblivion. The lore of Castle Cainhurst in Bloodborne is fascinating precisely because it feels both connected to and separate from the rest of the game. Though the downfall of the Vilebloods is tied to the city's history, the healing church, the corruption of the old blood, and the hunger for immortality, Cainhurst is still isolated. A Gothic castle, haunted by ghosts, ruled by a beautiful, immortal vampire queen. In the end, the Vilebloods are violent, bloodthirsty figures, corrupted by the old blood, not so different from Dracula, whose very survival depends entirely on blood. As the powerful vampire himself once said, blood is too precious a thing in these days of dishonorable peace. If you enjoy this kind of content, where I explore the intersection of video game lore, history, and literature, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, until next time, bye!